Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Today we have a very special show looking at the Israel Defense Forces, how they operate in times of conflict, the codes they operate under, and some of the experiences of people who've served within them. And two such people are with me in the JTV studio today. We have Noru Tsalic, who served for an extended period of time in the West Bank and Golan Heights, but is currently the UK representative for reservists on duty, an Israeli organisation. And we have Tamir Oren, who served in Gaza twice in two different conflicts and is currently the UK representative for Stand With Us here. Now, thank you for joining us, gentlemen. I'm curious to start with just the base story you had, the years you were in service, the conflicts or the most dangerous situations you faced. I'll start with you, Noru.
Okay, so I served from about 1989 to, I think, 2004 is when they released me from reserve duty, mostly in the West Bank.
Could you actually just explain the reserve philosophy for people who are watching? Because people may not get how that works.
I keep forgetting that not everybody is aware of what happens in Israel. So usually, in Israel, both boys and girls are recruited into the IDF at 18. Boys serve normally for 3 years, girls serve for 2 years. And then you are shifted into the reserve corps, and you continue to serve about a month every year. In theory, until you're about 55, but in practice, if you're in a combat unit, then usually 42 or 43, I think, these days. Tamir, you might be more up to date. They release you.
Right, and that means, and Tamir, you've obviously had that experience as well, that means that in the reserves, if a conflict breaks out during the period you're a reservist on duty, you get drafted in.
You get drafted in. You can get drafted in every single second. And in 2014, I was drafted. I was a young student. I took my uniform from my house and went to protect the Gazan border in the southern border of Israel. I said goodbye to my wife and to my family while I heard the sirens yelling in Tel Aviv, actually, in the city. I went to the north, to the south, to defend my family.
Right, very interesting. So that's the system. So back to your story then. You served 89 to 2004.
I served, for instance, in the West Bank during the first intifada. I remember that time very well. I remember it. I have to say, these days, I sometimes read or hear people who haven't been there describing the first intifada, and I don't recognize it. Doesn't.
What did it look like to you then? What were the situations you faced?
It was a violent conflict. It wasn't a series of peaceful demonstrations or protests. It was a violent conflict. It was actually a mixture of terrorist attacks on one hand and violent clashes between usually mobs of Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza and Israeli troops. Usually we were on routine duty in those areas, and therefore we were in a minority in terms of numbers. Okay, we were better armed, but in a minority, and I remember feeling quite a substantial threat to life and limb
from those incidents.
From those instances, people coming, mobs coming towards you with things like axes and steel chains, not
things that could cause serious damage. This is not just
not a pleasant experience, a threatening experience by all.
Tamir, your experience was slightly different. A little later. Tell us about that.
So I joined the army in 2006 to the paratroopers brigade. I decided to be a commander, then officer. So in 2008, I found myself as an officer in the Gaza border, defending the border from terrorists infiltrating towards Israel. And between the years of 2000 and 2008, we had missiles fired from Gaza towards Israel on a daily basis. 8,000 missiles, to be frank. And they were fired at hospitals, schools, our base, the villages that we protected. And throughout those years, I found myself as a soldier running to shelter, like the citizens that I was supposed to protect. And I asked myself, okay, I came here to serve my people, defend my people. What am I doing here? And in 2008, the mission came, and I was one of the first soldiers.
This is Operation
Gaza.
Cast Lead, yes.
Operation Cast Lead. And I was one of the first soldiers, the paratrooper soldiers, entering Gaza to neutralize those missile launches that were fired at my people. And the most interesting story was the story of the first night, where the mission, my first mission, was to enter a building where missiles were fired from. And apparently that building was a school. So we entered a booby-trapped school. So after we understood that it was booby-trapped, we took a step back. We neutralized those rockets and those explosives, and we got in. And I saw a regular school, like the schools that we have here in the UK, the schools that we have in Israel. We have playgrounds, the nice decorated walls. And then I saw missiles and missile launches inside the playground of the school. And that shocked me on a personal basis, because you see the hatred and the incitement within the education system. That's what I faced as a young officer in the paratroopers in 2008.
How far did you go into Gaza?
I spent the whole operation in Gaza, more than 2 weeks, and we were in charge of all the northern part of the Gaza Strip from Israel to the sea.
Right, okay, interesting. Now, obviously there's very different circumstances. Israel was sort of overseeing the West Bank at the time you were there. Israel was not overseeing the Gaza Strip when you were there, so it was almost like crossing into different territory. I think it's an interesting perspective. However, were there, perhaps you can explain the basic, I suppose, codes of conduct you are told to operate under in the Israeli Defense Forces? How does that work, Noru?
Well, the way it worked is, for instance, before going on a Miluim tour or shift in the West Bank, we spent a couple of days inside Israel on a military base training, and training mostly in the use of non-lethal riot control.
Examples being?
Example being tear gas and rubber bullets, including all the what we were taught as safety issues, when to fire them, the safe distances from which to fire at the population, not to fire directly at the population, for instance, tear gas canisters and things like that. All that we were taught, and we were drilled into the safe use of those methods. Needless to say, so that's one point. That's before actually going into the West Bank. The second thing I'd like to say, I recall it very well, every single time you leave base to go, for instance, on a patrol or go on guard duty or any sort of mission outside the base in the West Bank, you get a briefing just before going. You get a briefing where all that is reminded to you, including the live fire instructions, which were always, in my time, you don't fire unless your life or the life of another innocent is in danger. And unless it's a clear and immediate danger, there's a series of, so for instance, what we were always taught, even if, say, a civilian approaches your guard post with a cold weapon, with a knife, if it's far enough, if your life is not immediately in danger, you've got to ask him, first of all, to stop. If he doesn't stop, you've got to fire in the air and ask him to stop. And only if he's
really closing in on you,
actually endanger you, then you're allowed. And you're allowed generally to, you've got to try to hit the lower part of his body, so not kill him, incapacitate him, if
Okay.
at all possible.
Different circumstances. You were going into essentially enemy territory and missiles being fired. Slightly different focus. Were they similar? Different instructions? What were you told when you were going over? How were you to act when it came to civilians and indeed the terrorists?
So first of all, when a soldier joins the army, he receives a booklet. The booklet is called the Moral Code of Conduct. It's like the soldier's Bible, if you may. It tells you when you can engage in fire, when you cannot. And it specifically tells you that if they are innocent people, you won't fire at those people. And before we entered the Gaza Strip, we had airplanes dropping leaflets on the ground with specific maps and directions where to go in order to be safe. Where are the safe spaces in the Gaza Strip? We broadcasted on their TV and radio, sent text messages to the people in Gaza, informed them exactly where to be in order for them not to get hit. And the problem is that there's an elephant in the room here, and I'll try to kind of emphasize this because, Alan, if I come to you and say, look, I'm going to hit you with my right hand in about 5 seconds, and I'm going to hit your left cheek just under your ear over here, what will you do? You'll either duck or stop me, right? And this is a problem because when the IDF told the Gazans where they're going to hit and where they're going to attack, Hamas knew exactly what will happen. And there was no element of surprise whatsoever during that operation. But at the end of the day, as a soldier, myself, and an officer, I knew that I know how to face terrorists, that know I'm going to come, than facing students, citizens, people like yourselves. And that was the most important part, not to face innocent people, because we know how to deal with terrorists, but we don't want to deal with innocent people within that battlefield.
Well, and how do you deal with obviously the difficult case of human shields, or, as you said, the use of civilian infrastructure for terrorist activities?
So this is challenging because Hamas knew we were going to come. And sometimes he placed families in these places. Sometimes he placed students in these places. And in the school that I went in, I saw posters of shaheeds, of suicide bombers. And I could imagine the students sitting there and studying in the classroom while missiles are fired. So we did all these precautions, all these leaflets, and all these TV broadcasts in order to prevent people from being there and evacuating them. So that's what we did. And when we found people, we knew where to take them to in order for them to be safe. But to be very honest, in those 2 weeks that I was in the Gaza Strip, I found only 2 civilians because they knew that they want to be safe,
right,
and
so
they were evacuated.
What happens, Noru, if a soldier deviates from this? Are they punished? How does that work?
They will be punished. The first, as with any crime, in order to be punished, you have to be caught, of course. But you're very rarely alone in these situations, and your own colleagues will report on you if you do something illegal, because not in the least, because if they, apart from the moral issues, which obviously I'm saying apart, but they're very important, but they would be accomplices if they don't report.
So you're saying there is a fear, there would be a fear amongst everyone, you're going to be caught up in a justice investigation?
I think there will be, first of all, a moral, imperative to report, because, people don't... I know we're sometimes depicted in the media as some sort of monsters, the IDF soldiers. Well, IDF soldiers are people like Tamir and me, I don't want to see innocent people harmed. I would never cover up something like that. And my colleagues, my comrades wouldn't have covered up something like that. Having said that, let's be very, very clear. Innocent people were killed by IDF actions. Unfortunately, heart-breaking fact is that they were killed. In the vast majority of cases, completely, not deliberately, and yes, in many cases unavoidably.
An issue, unfortunately, that all armies face in conflicts, a conflict zone.
Absolutely, and one of the problems is IDF is never compared, or IDF's record in terms of protecting innocent life is never compared with that of other armies from democratic
Let me ask
countries.
one quick question, Tamir, very quickly. Just on that, on this issue of comparisons and beyond, what's your message to people watching this about the IDF's operation versus other armies?
So the IDF is trying to do everything in its power to prevent innocent people from getting killed. We have to understand, like Noru said, war is hell. War is hell. I've been there in the battlefield. War is hell. People get killed. People get injured from both sides. But we're trying to do is to prevent the innocent people from getting killed. And we have these precautions like those flyers and leaflets, like those TV broadcasts, like those text messages, and all of these things in order to prevent that from happening. But unfortunately, it does. And we need to understand that. And when the UK fights its wars in Afghanistan, when the US fights its wars in different places around the world, people get killed. And that's unfortunate. But we're trying our best to prevent that.
Best solution is no conflict, no need for conflict. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you all as well. We'll see you again soon for another episode of Current Affairs on JTV.
To stay up to date with the latest JTV content, if you're on YouTube, click subscribe below the video and the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, click the like button, and under following, click see first.